The city was alive with its usual symphony of honking cabs, distant sirens, and hurried conversations. Christmas was only days away, and the streets of Manhattan buzzed with holiday cheer. Storefronts adorned with twinkling lights, the scent of roasted chestnuts wafting through the air. Yet for Emma Carter, the festive atmosphere meant little. She shifted from foot to foot, trying to keep warm. The thin layers of clothing she wore barely shielded her from the biting wind. Snowflakes clung to her auburn curls, melting into icy droplets against her skin. Her arms ached from holding the flowers for hours. The bouquet was lighter than before. She had managed to sell a few to kind strangers earlier in the evening, but she still needed to sell one more before she could go home. People hurried past her, wrapped in their expensive scarves and thick coats, their eyes avoiding hers. She tried again, stepping forward as a couple exited a nearby cafe. "Would you like to buy a rose, sir?" she asked, her voice steady despite her chattering teeth. The man barely spared her a glance. The woman scoffed, shaking her head. "Ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, looping her arm through her partner's. "Where are this child's parents?" Emma clenched her jaw, swallowing the sting of rejection. She knew what they thought, that she was just another street kid, a nuisance. But they didn't know the truth. She had a home, even if it wasn't much, and she had a family that she was desperately trying to protect. And so she tried again. She stepped toward another passerby, a man in a crisp suit, stepping out of a sleek black car. His expensive shoes clicked against the pavement as he walked toward a high-end restaurant, completely absorbed in his phone. Emma hesitated for a split second. Something about him was different. He carried himself with an air of power, of untouchable wealth. The kind of man who probably never had to think about things like hunger or cold. But she couldn't afford to be selective. Summoning her courage, she lifted the rose. "Excuse me, sir," she said. "Would you like to buy a flower?" He stopped. For a brief moment, he looked at her. Really looked at her. And then, without a word, he walked away. Emma's heart sank, but she refused to give up. She moved to step forward, to try again, when suddenly her foot caught on the icy pavement. With a startled gasp, she stumbled forward, her hands instinctively clutching the bouquet. The flowers slipped from her grip. The world seemed to slow as the delicate petals scattered across the snow, staining the icy ground with splashes of red. Emma hit the pavement hard, the impact jarring her bones. Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she simply sat there stunned, and then the weight of everything crashed over her. The exhaustion, the hunger, the sheer unfairness of it all. Tears burned in her eyes. She never cried, but tonight, she was tired. She reached out, gathering the fallen flowers with trembling fingers, whispering to herself, "It's okay," she murmured. "I can still sell them." She had to, because if she didn't, Liam wouldn't have any milk tonight. She bit her lip hard, forcing the sobs back, and picked up the last flower, just one more. She looked up and saw the man. The same man who had walked away moments ago, standing there, watching her. His gaze flickered between the crushed petals and her tear-streaked face. Something in his expression shifted. Emma sniffled, tightening her grip on the flower, and tried again. "Please, sir," she whispered. "Just one flower. If I sell one more, I can buy my little brother some milk." For a long moment, he didn't move. Then slowly, Alexander Reed knelt down. His gloved hand reached out, not for his wallet, but for the photo that had slipped from Emma's pocket in the fall. He picked it up, turning it over, his brows furrowed. It was an old photograph of a young woman in business attire, smiling warmly. A woman he once knew, Sarah Carter. A strange, unfamiliar feeling twisted in Alexander's chest. He lifted his gaze to Emma, her wide brown eyes full of hope and quiet defiance. Without thinking, he reached into his coat pocket, but before he could say a word, a loud voice rang out from across the street. "Hey, kid, you know, you're not supposed to be selling here." A police officer? Emma's eyes widened in fear. Without hesitation, she turned and ran, vanishing into the crowded streets before Alexander could stop her. He stood there, gripping the old photograph in his hand, staring after her. For the first time in years, he felt something stir deep inside him, and he knew this wasn't the last time he would see that little girl. The cold night air cut through the narrow alleyways of Manhattan like a silent blade. Emma Carter sprinted through the streets, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Her thin shoes barely provided any protection against the icy pavement. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Behind her, the uniformed officer's voice still echoed in her ears. "Hey, kid, you know you're not supposed to be selling here." She knew the routine all too well. She had been chased off the streets before. If she was caught, they'd call child services, and she couldn't let that happen. She couldn't be taken away from Liam and Mom. Dodging past a group of tourists, Emma veered into an alley, her heart pounding. She clutched the single flower she had left, pressing it to her chest. The bouquet had been ruined when she fell, but this one remained untouched. It was all she had left. She reached a rusted fire escape and scaled it with the practiced ease of someone who had done it before. A few floors up, she crouched in the shadows, her small frame hidden behind an old air vent. From here, she could see the police officer give up and walk away, shaking his head. Only then did Emma allow herself to breathe. But the moment her body relaxed, another realization hit her: the photograph. Panic surged through her chest. The picture of her mother, the only picture they had left of her from the time before everything fell apart, was gone. Her stomach twisted into a painful knot. She had to go back. Across the street, Alexander Reed still stood in place, staring at the worn photograph in his gloved hands. Sarah Carter. He hadn't heard that name in years. The memory was buried deep, so deep that it took him a moment to recall the details. Sarah had worked at Reed Enterprises over a decade ago. She had been sharp, ambitious, with a keen sense of business. He remembered she had a warm smile, the kind that made people trust her instantly. And then, one day, she was gone, fired. Alexander barely remembered the specifics. Corporate scandals came and went. He had always been too busy looking forward to dwell on the past. But looking at the girl, Emma, he knew there was more to the story than he had ever realized. Emma waited until she was sure the coast was clear before she climbed back down. She moved cautiously, staying in the shadows as she retraced her steps. She had to find the photograph. As she neared the spot where she had fallen, she froze. Alexander Reed was still standing there, and he was holding the photograph. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and stepped forward. "That's mine." Her voice was firm, despite the slight tremor in her hands. Alexander turned to her. His gaze was unreadable. "This woman," he said, holding up the photograph. "She's your mother?" Emma hesitated. Most adults she met on the street didn't ask questions, and if they did, it was never out of real concern. It was to judge, to pity. She had no patience for either. "Yes," she said, chin lifted defiantly. "Now give it back." Something flickered in Alexander's expression. For a man who rarely showed emotion, it was an odd feeling to be caught off guard by a child. But Emma's sharp gaze, the way she held herself despite the cold, the hunger, the exhaustion, it reminded him of someone. Slowly, he handed her the photograph. Emma grabbed it, shoving it into the pocket of her tattered coat. "You're selling flowers," Alexander stated, as if only now processing the absurdity of the situation. "At night, in the freezing cold," Emma shrugged. "I have to." "Where are your parents?" She hesitated before answering. "My mom's sick," she admitted. "She can't work. And Liam, my little brother. He's only 5. Alexander studied her. A girl like her, 10 years old, fending for her family, shouldn't exist in his world. In his version of New York, children didn't work. They went to school, played in safe neighborhoods, had warm homes to return to. But his world was clearly different from hers. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his wallet. "How much for all the flowers?" Emma's expression hardened. "You can't just give me money." Alexander frowned. "Why not?" She lifted the single undamaged flower in her hands. "Because I'm selling roses, not begging." Alexander was stunned into silence. Most kids, most adults, would have grabbed at the opportunity without hesitation. But Emma had pride, and that, more than anything, piqued his interest. He took the rose from her hand, examining it under the glow of the streetlight. Then, for the first time in years, Alexander Reed did something entirely impulsive. He pulled out a crisp $100 bill and handed it to her. "For the flower," he said simply. Emma hesitated, staring at the bill. Then, slowly, she reached out and took it. It was more money than she had ever seen in her entire life. But before she could say anything, a sharp whistle cut through the air. Emma stiffened. Across the street, a shadowy figure emerged from a doorway. Leo, the thug, who controlled this stretch of the street. "Hey, kid," Leo called out. "You know the rules. Where's my cut?" Emma's stomach clenched. She turned to Alexander. "You should go." Alexander frowned. "Who is that?" But before she could answer, Leo had already crossed the street, eyes gleaming as he eyed the bill in Emma's hand. "Hand it over, sweetheart." Emma gritted her teeth. "No." Leo's expression darkened. He reached forward, but before he could grab her, a strong hand clamped down on his wrist. Leo let out a startled curse, turning to see Alexander towering over him, his grip like steel. "I don't think she was talking to you," Alexander said, his voice dangerously quiet. Leo jerked his hand away, scowling. He wasn't used to people standing up to him, especially not wealthy businessmen. "You don't know how things work around here," Leo sneered. Alexander smiled, a cold, humorless smile. "No," he agreed, "but I do know how to end them." Leo hesitated. Something in Alexander's gaze made it clear. This was not a man to be messed with. With a muttered curse, he took a step back. "This ain't over, kid." He spat before disappearing into the shadows. Emma exhaled slowly. Her hands were still shaking. She turned to Alexander. "You shouldn't have done that," she muttered. Alexander slipped his hands into his pockets, studying her. "You shouldn't have to fight for something that should be freely yours," he said. Emma stared at him, unsure of how to respond. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure if she was facing a threat or an ally. And Alexander, for the first time in his life, he had no idea what he was doing. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't walking away from this girl. Not this time. The streets of New York City never slept. But for Emma Carter, the night felt eerily silent as she walked home. The crisp $100 bill Alexander had given her burned in her pocket like a heavy weight. She should have felt relieved. $100. That was enough to buy food for the week. Enough to make sure Liam had milk and her mother had medicine. But instead, she felt uneasy. Alexander Reed was a mystery. A rich man who should have walked past her like every other stranger. But he didn't. He noticed her. He bought a single flower for $100, and now he had made an enemy out of Leo. Emma clenched her fists as she picked up her pace. Leo wouldn't let this go. He always got his cut, one way or another. She reached the worn-down apartment building where she lived and took the stairs two at a time. Their home was on the 4th floor, the hallway dimly lit and smelling of damp carpet. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door. Inside, the small apartment was silent, except for the rhythmic wheezing of her mother's breathing. Sarah Carter lay on the couch, her face pale under the dim light of the kitchen lamp. Liam was curled up beside her, his tiny frame wrapped in a blanket, his arms hugging an old stuffed rabbit. Emma swallowed hard, forcing herself to smile. "I'm home, Mom." Sarah stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. "Emma." Her voice was weak, barely above a whisper. "How was tonight?" Emma hesitated before pulling out the money. She knelt beside her mother, pressing the bill into her frail hands. Sarah's eyes widened. "Emma, where did you get this?" "I sold flowers," Emma said quickly. "A man bought one and gave me a big tip." Sarah studied her daughter's face. "Who?" Emma hesitated. She didn't know what to say. "Just someone," she muttered. "It doesn't matter, right? We have enough for food now." Sarah didn't look convinced. She coughed, her body trembling from the effort. Emma hurried to the kitchen, filling a cup with water and bringing it back. Sarah took small sips, her hands shaking. "Emma, you need to be careful," she whispered. "There are people out there who will use kindness to get what they want." Emma frowned. Alexander didn't feel like that kind of person. But then again, she had thought the world was fair once, and that belief had crumbled a long time ago. Across the city, Alexander Reed sat in the back of his black luxury car, staring at the city lights through the tinted glass. He couldn't stop thinking about Emma. She was just a child, yet she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. It reminded him too much of someone else, someone he had once known. He pulled the worn photograph from his coat pocket and studied it under the glow of the car's interior light. Sarah Carter. Something about this didn't make sense. She had worked at Reed Enterprises a decade ago. She had been a promising employee until one day she was gone. He barely remembered the details. Back then, his company had been expanding rapidly, and employee terminations were handled by the legal department. But something about this case nagged at him. "Rachel," he called out. From the front seat, Rachel Porter, his personal assistant, glanced up from her tablet. "Yes, Mr. Reed? Find out everything you can about Sarah Carter. I want to know why she was fired." Rachel hesitated before nodding. Alexander rarely looked into former employees. He had never cared before. So why now? Emma was back on the streets before sunrise, her breath visible in the morning cold. She had to sell more flowers before school started. She stuck to the busier streets, avoiding Leo's territory. She didn't want another confrontation. But as she rounded a corner, she stopped short. Leo was waiting, his arms crossed, his expression dark. Emma's stomach clenched. She turned to run, but two other boys stepped in front of her, blocking her escape. "Where's my cut?" Leo asked, his voice low. I don't have anything," Emma stammered. Leo smirked. "Liar. That rich guy gave you money. I saw it." Emma's heart pounded. She reached into her pocket and pulled out 2 crumpled dollar bills. "Here," she said, shoving them toward him. "That's all I have." Leo snatched the money, sneering. "This ain't enough." Emma braced herself, ready to run or fight, whichever came first. But before Leo could do anything else, a deep voice cut through the alley. "Let her go." Everyone turned. Standing at the alley entrance, dressed in a tailored coat and leather gloves, was Alexander Reed. His blue eyes were cold as steel, his posture unshaken. Leo faltered for the first time. He wasn't used to dealing with men like Alexander. "Stay out of this, old man," Leo snapped. "This ain't your business." Alexander took a slow, deliberate step forward. "I make it my business," he said. "When you threaten a child." The tension in the air was thick. Emma's hands clenched into fists. She didn't want Alexander's help. She had handled herself before. She didn't. The tension in the air was thick. Emma's hands clenched into fists. She didn't want Alexander's help. She had handled herself before. She didn't need saving. But this time she wasn't sure if she could get out of this without help. Leo scoffed. "You don't know how things work around here." Alexander's lips curled into a smirk. "You're right." His voice was calm, controlled. "Dangerous. But I do know how to end things." Leo hesitated. Something in Alexander's presence, his sheer authority, his unwavering confidence, made it clear. This wasn't just some rich guy. This was a man with power. Leo muttered a curse and backed off. "This ain't over, kid." And just like that, he disappeared. Emma let out a slow breath. She turned to Alexander. "Why are you helping me?" Alexander studied her. He had no idea why he was doing this. All he knew was that he wasn't walking away. Not from her. Not this time. The wind was sharp as a blade, cutting through the alleys of New York City with an unforgiving chill. But inside the warmth of a quiet corner cafe, the tension between Emma Carter and Alexander Reed was even sharper. Emma sat across from the billionaire, her small fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of cocoa. The aroma of melted chocolate filled the air, but she barely noticed it. Her gaze was locked onto Alexander, her expression a mix of defiance and unease. "You shouldn't have helped me." Her voice was firm, but Alexander caught the slight tremor beneath it. He took a sip of his black coffee unfazed. "Why not?" Emma frowned. Now Leo's gonna be even angrier. He doesn't like losing. Alexander leaned forward, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "Neither do I." A flicker of something crossed Emma's face. Curiosity, perhaps, or suspicion. But she didn't respond. Instead, she focused on her drink, blowing on it as if she wasn't trapped in a conversation with a man who had no business caring about a kid like her. Alexander had been studying Emma carefully since the moment she stepped into his car earlier that morning. He had expected her to be scared, maybe even desperate, but instead she was cautious, calculating. This girl had learned how to survive. She wasn't used to kindness. She didn't trust it. And that troubled him more than it should have. Reaching into his coat pocket, Alexander pulled out the photograph, the same one Emma had dropped the night before. He placed it gently on the table between them. Emma's eyes widened. Her fingers clenched around her mug. "Where did you get that?" she demanded. Alexander didn't answer right away. He studied the photo. A younger Sarah Carter, standing in front of a modern glass building, dressed in a crisp blazer and pencil skirt. A Reed Enterprises employee badge pinned to her chest. "Your mother," Alexander said at last, tapping the photo. "She worked for me." Emma's breath hitched. "You knew her?" Alexander hesitated. Did he? The truth was, he barely remembered Sarah Carter. She had worked at his company 10 years ago, in a mid-level position. Then, just as quickly as she had risen, she had disappeared, fired, or, if Alexander's gut was right, sacrificed. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. "Tell me, Emma, what do you know about why she left?" Emma's face darkened. She hesitated, then muttered, "She was fired for stealing." Alexander's brow furrowed. "Do you believe that?" he asked. Emma's fists clenched in her lap. "No." Her voice was sharp, unwavering. "My mom would never steal," she said. She was set up. Alexander remained silent. There was something in Emma's voice that struck a chord within him. Conviction. But more than that, pain. Across town, inside the towering headquarters of Reed Enterprises, Rachel Porter sat at her desk, a laptop open in front of her. She scrolled through old employee records, her expression tightening with every click. Sarah Carter's termination file was sealed. Not just fired, erased. Rachel frowned, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Someone didn't want this file to be found, which only meant one thing. Alexander was right to dig deeper. She picked up her phone and dialed. "Mr. Reed," she said the moment he answered, "we have a problem." Back at the cafe, Emma sat stiffly as Alexander processed what she had just told him. He ran a hand through his dark hair, his mind piecing together fragments of an unfinished puzzle. Sarah Carter, a promising employee, fired for stealing. But what if she never stole anything at all? Alexander tapped his fingers against the table. "Emma," he said, his voice thoughtful, "if I told you I might be able to find out the truth, would you want to know?" Emma looked up sharply. "You can do that?" Alexander's lips curved slightly. "I own the company," he reminded her. Emma swallowed. She shouldn't trust him. But what if he was telling the truth? What if he really could uncover what happened to her mother? And more importantly, what if it changed everything? For the first time, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Emma didn't know that at that very moment, in the shadows of a downtown office, someone else was watching. A man in a tailored gray suit leaned against a marble desk, his fingers drumming against polished wood. His sharp green eyes narrowed as he listened to the phone pressed against his ear. "Alexander Reed is looking into Sarah Carter," the voice on the other end whispered. A slow, calculated smile spread across the man's lips. "Is he now?" The man turned his gaze toward the city skyline. This was not the news he wanted to hear. And if Alexander wasn't careful, he wouldn't like what happened next. The air was thick with tension as Alexander Reed stepped into his office, the city skyline stretching beyond the glass walls behind him. The weight of the conversation with Emma Carter still pressed against his mind, but now he had something more pressing: Sarah Carter's file. His assistant, Rachel Porter, stood by his desk, her face unusually grim. A thin stack of printed documents lay in front of her, along with a USB drive. "Tell me," Alexander ordered, his voice low. Rachel exhaled. "It wasn't easy to find. Someone went to great lengths to bury it." She pushed the documents forward. "But I did." Alexander picked up the file and flipped through it. His sharp blue eyes scanned the pages, his expression unreadable. Then he stopped, and his fingers tightened around the paper. Robert Kane. The name was printed at the bottom of Sarah Carter's termination letter. Alexander's jaw clenched. Robert Kane, his former CFO, his one-time right-hand man, his most trusted confidant, until he wasn't. Years ago, Robert had betrayed him, attempting to manipulate financial reports to embezzle money from Reed Enterprises. Alexander had uncovered the deception just in time, but not before Robert had covered his tracks. And now, here he was again. Rachel continued. Sarah Carter was accused of financial misconduct. The amount? $500,000, stolen from a corporate charity fund. She looked up. "Does that sound familiar?" Alexander felt a slow rage coil in his chest. It was the exact same sum Robert had been suspected of stealing before he was forced to resign. Alexander exhaled, his grip tightening around the documents. "So, let me guess," he murmured. "Sarah Carter was the scapegoat." Rachel nodded. "All the evidence points to it." She hesitated, then added, "And there's more." She inserted the USB drive into her laptop and turned the screen toward him. A series of old security logs flashed on the screen. Rachel tapped the screen. The day Sarah was fired. She was supposed to have transferred the stolen money from her work account. She clicked. A login timestamp appeared. Alexander frowned. The login happened at 10:47 p.m. Rachel gave him a knowing look. Sarah Carter had already been escorted out of the building by security at 9:30 p.m. A beat of silence stretched between them. Then, Alexander swore under his breath. Emma Carter moved through the dimly lit alleyways of Brooklyn, her breath visible in the freezing air. She clutched her small backpack tightly, her knuckles raw from the cold. She was running late. She hated being late, not because her mother would be angry. Sarah Carter never got angry, but because her absence meant Liam was alone. She turned a corner and entered the worn-down apartment complex where they lived. The walls were cracked, the elevator permanently out of service. She hurried up the stairs. When she reached their apartment, she hesitated. Something felt off. The door was slightly open. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She pushed it open and froze. Her mother sat on the couch, her face pale, and standing across from her was a man Emma had hoped never to see again. Leo. His leather jacket was unzipped, revealing a knife tucked into his belt. A slow smirk curled his lips. "Well, well," he drawled. "There's our little entrepreneur." Emma's fists clenched. "Get out." Leo chuckled, shaking his head. "That's not how this works, kid." His gaze flickered to Sarah. "Your mom and I were just having a nice chat." Sarah's lips were pressed tightly together, but Emma saw the fear in her eyes. This wasn't about her. This was about the money. Leo wanted payment, and if he didn't get it, Emma knew exactly what would happen next. Leo sighed dramatically. "See, Emma, I'm a reasonable guy." He took a step forward, and Emma instinctively shielded her mother. "You owe me money, but I'm willing to make a deal." Emma didn't speak. She knew better than to take the bait. Leo grinned. "You work for me." Her stomach turned. "No." Leo's grin faded. That wasn't a request. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small envelope. He tossed it onto the table. "That's $500. Consider it an advance." Emma didn't move. "Do whatever you want with it," Leo continued. "But come tomorrow, you start working for me." Then, with a final smirk, he turned and walked toward the door. He paused. "If you don't?" His green eyes darkened. "Well, let's just say, bad things happen to people who don't pay their debts." The door slammed shut. A suffocating silence settled over the room. Emma's fingers curled into fists, and Sarah whispered, "Emma, what are we going to do?" Hours later, as Emma lay awake on the worn-out mattress she shared with Liam, her mind raced. They had no options, no money. And Leo wasn't bluffing. Her fingers brushed against the envelope still sitting on the table. Then she thought of Alexander Reed. He had offered to help. But could she really trust him? Her mother had always taught her to stand on her own 2 feet. But right now, she had no other choice. The next morning, Alexander Reed's phone buzzed. A message flashed across the screen. Unknown number. "I need your help. Meet me at the cafe. Noon." His lips pressed into a thin line. Then he grabbed his coat. Across town, in a sleek penthouse office, Robert Kane leaned back in his leather chair, his phone pressed to his ear. His expression was calm. Too calm. "Yes," he murmured, listening. "I understand." A pause. Then a slow smile curved his lips. "Then, we'll just have to make sure Reed stops asking questions." His eyes gleamed. Permanently, the rain had turned into a thin drizzle by the time Alexander Reed arrived at the cafe. The dimly lit diner was nearly empty. save for an elderly waitress refilling a coffee cup and a couple of late-night stragglers hunched over their plates. And then he saw her, Emma Carter. She sat in the corner booth, her small hands wrapped around a steaming mug. Her clothes were still damp from the night before, and her blonde hair hung in damp strands over her shoulders. But it was her eyes that caught him off guard. They were haunted. This wasn't just a little girl trying to sell flowers anymore. Something had happened. Alexander slid into the seat across from her. "Talk to me." Emma hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the ceramic mug. "I need your help." She took a deep breath. "It's my mom." Emma's words came rushed, filled with urgency. She told him everything. The money Leo demanded, the threats, the envelope sitting on their kitchen table. By the time she finished, her voice had dropped to a whisper. "I don't know what to do." Silence stretched between them. Then Alexander exhaled. "You should have called the police." Emma laughed bitterly. "And tell them what?" She shook her head. "People like Leo don't go to jail." She looked him in the eye. "People like you do something about it." Alexander's fingers tapped against the table. She wasn't wrong. He had spent years maneuvering corporate boardrooms, tearing down empires with a single phone call. But this wasn't business. This was personal. And he wasn't sure why he suddenly cared so much. Finally, he spoke. "Take me to your mother." The Carter apartment was even worse than he had imagined. The paint was peeling. The ceiling leaked. A single flickering light bulb illuminated the tiny kitchen. Sarah Carter sat at the table, her hands folded in her lap. She was thinner than he remembered, but the moment their eyes met, recognition flickered. "You," she whispered. Her hands trembled as she pushed herself up. "You're Alexander Reed." Emma's head whipped toward him. "Wait. What?" Alexander's mouth pressed into a thin line. "We've met before." Sarah's lips parted. 10 years ago." Emma stared at them, her gaze darting between them. "You knew each other?" Alexander nodded slowly. "Your mother used to work for me." Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "Until you fired me." The room was suffocatingly quiet. Alexander leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You know, that's not what happened." Sarah shook her head. "All I know is that my life was destroyed." Her voice was tired, brittle. "One day I was an employee. The next, I was accused of theft." She looked at him. "And you never even gave me a chance to prove my innocence." A long silence stretched between them. Then Alexander spoke. "I know you didn't do it." Sarah flinched. "What?" His jaw tightened. "You were set up." Her breath hitched. "By who?" Alexander hesitated. Then he said it. "Robert Kane." Sarah gripped the edge of the counter. "Robert Kane?" Her voice was hoarse. She pressed a hand to her temple. "That's not possible." Alexander exhaled. "It is." Emma watched them, stunned. Sarah turned to her daughter. "Emma, I need you to go check on Liam." Emma hesitated. "Mom." Sarah's gaze softened. "Please." Reluctantly, Emma left the kitchen. Sarah turned back to Alexander. "How do you know this?" He told her everything. The forged timestamps, the misplaced funds, the login records proving she wasn't responsible. Sarah slumped into the chair. 10 years, 10 years of struggle, all because of one man. Her fingers curled into fists. "I want justice." Alexander's gaze met hers. "So do I." But before either of them could speak, a loud bang echoed through the apartment. The front door had been kicked open. Emma's scream ripped through the air. Alexander spun around. Leo stood in the doorway, a smirk curling his lips. "Well, well." He stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind him. "I was wondering when we'd meet." Mr. Reed, Alexander's fingers itched to call his security team. But Leo wasn't alone. Two other men stood behind him, and one of them had a gun. Emma was trapped against the wall, her small fists clenched. Alexander's entire body went cold. "You don't want to do this," Leo chuckled. "Oh, but I do." His gaze flickered toward Emma. "I gave her a choice. She made the wrong one." Emma flinched. Leo reached into his jacket. Alexander moved before he even realized what he was doing. He lunged. The room erupted into chaos. Alexander slammed into Leo, knocking him against the counter. Emma darted toward her mother, shielding Liam with her body. One of Leo's men raised his gun. Bang! The gunshot shattered the silence. The bullet missed by inches, burying itself into the wall. Alexander moved fast. He grabbed the edge of the table and swung hard. The gunman went down with a grunt. Leo recovered, snarling. Big mistake. He lunged, but this time Sarah was ready. She smashed a glass vase over his head. Leo staggered. Alexander grabbed Emma and Liam, pulling them behind him, and then the sound of sirens filled the night air. The apartment door burst open. Police flooded the room. Leo froze. Then his face twisted with rage. "You called the cops?" Alexander smiled coldly. "No." His eyes flickered toward Emma. "She did." Leo's face paled. And then he was dragged away in handcuffs. The apartment was silent once the police were gone. Emma sat on the couch, her knees tucked to her chest. Alexander sat beside her. She didn't speak for a long time. Then, "Thank you." Her voice was small. Alexander looked down at her. Then, for the first time in a long time, he smiled. "You're welcome." But he knew this wasn't over. Leo was gone, but Robert Kane was still out there. And if there was one thing Alexander Reed knew, the real fight was just beginning. The night was eerily quiet after the chaos that had unfolded just hours before. The Carter apartment had been left in shambles, broken glass, overturned furniture, and bullet holes in the walls, grim reminders of how close they had come to losing everything. Emma sat on the couch, knees pulled up to her chest, clutching the warm fleece blanket Alexander had draped over her shoulders. She hadn't spoken much since the police took Leo away, but her mind was racing. She had survived. But survival wasn't enough. Emma wasn't naive. Leo might be gone, but people like him didn't work alone. She glanced toward her mother, who sat silently at the kitchen table, rubbing her temples. Sarah Carter looked exhausted. And Alexander? He stood by the window, his silhouette outlined against the dim city lights. His expression was unreadable, but Emma knew better. He was thinking, planning, preparing for the next step. Then finally he turned. "I need you to tell me everything you know about Robert Kane." Sarah's breath caught. His name alone sent a shiver down her spine. She swallowed hard. "That man took everything from me." Sarah's story unfolded in broken whispers, painful memories she had tried to bury resurfacing like ghosts from the past. "I wasn't just an employee at Reed Enterprises," she admitted. "I was a rising executive. Kane knew I was going to expose his fraud, so he framed me before I could." She clenched her fists. "I thought someone would fight for me, that the company would look into it." Her eyes flickered toward Alexander. "But you never did." A sharp silence settled in the room. Emma turned to Alexander, watching his jaw tighten. "I didn't know." His voice was low, regretful. "But I should have." Sarah let out a hollow laugh. "It doesn't matter now." "It does," Alexander countered. "Because I'm going to fix it." Emma sat up straighter. "How?" Alexander's gaze darkened. "I'm going to take everything from him, the way he took everything from your mother." Just as the conversation reached its tipping point, a sharp knock at the door cut through the tension. Everyone froze. Alexander instinctively stepped in front of Emma and Sarah, his sharp instincts taking over. "Stay here." He moved toward the door, fingers twitching near his phone, ready to call his security team. When he opened it, a man in a dark suit stood on the other side. Michael Carter, Emma's father. Sarah's face paled. "What are you doing here?" Michael smirked, stepping inside. "You think Kane is going to let you dig into his past without retaliation?" He turned to Alexander. "You just made yourself a very powerful enemy." Alexander stared him down. "I don't scare easily." Michael chuckled. "Then you're dumber than I thought." He turned to Sarah. "You need to drop this. Take Emma, take Liam, and disappear." Emma stepped forward. "No." Her voice was strong, unwavering. "I won't run." Michael's expression darkened. "Then you don't understand who you're dealing with." That night, as Alexander drove back to his penthouse, his mind was filled with calculations, risks, and next steps. He needed to take Kane down. And then, his phone buzzed. Unknown caller. He hesitated, then answered. "Mr. Reed." A smooth, chilling voice greeted him. "Robert Kane." Alexander's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Took you long enough to call?" Kane chuckled. "I hear you've been asking questions." Alexander didn't flinch. "I hear you don't like being exposed." A pause. Then Kane's voice dropped, venomous. "Walk away, Reed. You don't want to see how this ends." Alexander smirked. "I already know how it ends." He hung up. The battle had begun. By the next morning, Reed Enterprises was in turmoil. Kane had moved fast. Stock plummeted overnight. The press was swarming with accusations. Board members were calling for Alexander's resignation. It was an all-out attack. But Alexander wasn't about to fold. He called his most trusted allies. Rachel Porter, his ruthless, brilliant assistant. David Chen, his top cybersecurity expert. Daniel Pierce, a high-profile investigative journalist. "Find me everything on Kane." His voice was sharp. "We're going to end him." Meanwhile, back at the apartment, Emma wasn't about to sit out on the sidelines. She dug deeper, sneaking into public records, reading old newspaper articles. Then she found something. An old article. A photo of Robert Kane shaking hands with Leo. Her stomach dropped. She knew what this meant. Leo wasn't just a random thug. He worked for Kane. That night, as Emma was on her way home from school, she felt it. Someone was following her. Her heart pounded. She picked up the pace. Then, a van screeched to a stop beside her. A man lunged out. Emma screamed, but before he could grab her, a car came out of nowhere. Brakes screeched. Doors flew open. Alexander stepped out, his fists clenched. The men hesitated. They were outnumbered. A sharp whistle. They retreated, disappearing into the night. Emma collapsed into Alexander's arms. Her whole body shook. "They were going to take me." Alexander's jaw clenched. "I know." His arms tightened around her. "It's time to end this." Back at his penthouse, Alexander paced the room, his mind racing. They had one shot. They needed to expose Kane. Publicly, no, permanently. And he knew exactly how to do it. His phone rang. "Rachel." "We found something." She took a deep breath. "You're not going to believe this." Alexander's eyes darkened. "Tell me everything." Emma watched him. For the first time she saw it. The determination. The fire. He wasn't just helping her anymore. This was personal. The war had begun. The air inside Alexander's penthouse was thick with tension. Papers covered the glass coffee table, each one containing fragments of Robert Kane's empire of deceit. Screens flickered with financial transactions, confidential emails, and hidden shell companies, all evidence of corruption that could bring a man like Kane to his knees. Alexander stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city that had once belonged to him alone. But now, this wasn't just business. This was war. Emma sat cross-legged on the couch, a laptop perched on her knees. Her fingers moved furiously across the keyboard, her eyes scanning lines of data Rachel had sent over. She wasn't just some kid anymore. She was part of this. Sarah sat nearby, her hands clasped together as she watched them both. There was fear in her eyes, but beneath it, a flicker of something else. Hope. Alexander turned, his voice sharp. "Rachel, what do we have?" The speaker crackled, enough to burn Kane's empire to the ground. They had uncovered a hidden offshore account, linked directly to Kane. Millions of dollars laundered through fraudulent charities, slumlord operations, and bribed officials. It was the kind of evidence that even Kane couldn't spin his way out of. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about the people he had destroyed, the single mothers forced into poverty by his predatory lending, the workers who lost their jobs when he sold companies for profit, the families displaced when he bought up properties and tripled the rent. And Sarah Carter. She had just been one of many. Alexander clenched his jaw. It's not enough to expose him. We need to make sure he has nowhere to run. Emma snapped her fingers. Then, we hit him everywhere. All eyes turned to her. Her voice was clear, steady. Kane doesn't just survive because he's rich. He survives because of his connections, politicians, CEOs, investors. She looked at Alexander. We have to cut off every single one of them. A slow smile spread across Alexander's face. I like the way you think. The next few days were a blur of strategy and execution. Rachel leaked anonymous reports to financial news outlets. David Chen hacked into Kane's corporate servers, pulling files that showed illegal deals. Daniel Pierce, the journalist, was fed a confidential report linking Kane to offshore fraud. By the time the sun set on the third day, the media was in a frenzy. News anchors scrambled to report on the mysterious scandal unraveling around Robert Kane. Headlines screamed, CEO Robert Kane, accused of fraud, millions unaccounted for. Former employees speak out. We were set up. Stock market plummets. As Kane Enterprises faces crisis. The impact was immediate. Investors pulled out. Stockholders panicked. Clients cut ties. For the first time in his career, Robert Kane was losing control. But men like Kane didn't go down without a fight. And he fought dirty. That night, Alexander was returning from a late meeting when his driver suddenly slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched. A black SUV blocked the road. Before Alexander could react, 4 men stepped out. Their faces were calm. Too calm. And Alexander knew. This wasn't a robbery. This was a warning. The door was yanked open. A cold voice spoke. Mr. Reed, you're making powerful enemies. Alexander didn't flinch. I don't make enemies. I eliminate them. A smirk. We'll see about that. Then, a fist. A sharp crack. Pain exploded across Alexander's jaw. The last thing he saw before darkness took him Robert Kane's men walking away. Alexander came to in his penthouse. His head throbbed. His vision blurred. His ribs ached. Emma was sitting in a chair beside him, her eyes wide. You look terrible, she muttered. He let out a low chuckle, wincing at the pain. You should see the other guy. But behind her sarcasm, he saw it. Fear. And he hated that. He reached out, squeezing her hand. I'm fine. She bit her lip. They could have killed you? Alexander exhaled. Then we make sure they don't get another chance. Emma leaned forward. What's next? He grinned. We take him down, once and for all. They needed something bigger. Something that couldn't be ignored. And they had it. Sarah had kept one last piece of evidence. a signed confession from a former Kane executive. It was proof that Kane had orchestrated fraud, money laundering, and illegal terminations. But they couldn't just hand it over to the police. Kane had people everywhere. So they did something crazy. They leaked it live. Rachel arranged for a press conference. Emma uploaded the documents onto every major platform. By the time Kane realized what had happened, it was too late. The world had seen everything. It was over. Kane's company was in freefall. His accounts were frozen. Arrest warrants were issued. The last time Emma saw him, he was being dragged into a police car. He locked eyes with her through the window. And for the first time, he looked afraid. A week later, Emma found herself sitting in Alexander's office. She looked around at the luxurious space, the leather chairs, the mahogany desk, the view of New York stretching beyond the windows. And then she looked at Alexander. "So, what now?" He smiled. "You tell me." She blinked. "Me?" He leaned forward. "Emma, you're smarter than half the people who work for me. You know how to fight, how to survive. And I think you might be able to do a whole lot more." Her heart pounded. "Are you offering me a job?" He chuckled. "Not quite. But I want to invest in you, in your future." He slid a folder across the table. Emma hesitated before opening it. Inside was a scholarship. Her name was printed in bold letters at the top. Fully paid. Business school. Emma's breath hitched. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. "You're serious?" Alexander grinned. "I don't make offers I don't intend to keep." A long silence stretched between them. Then, Emma picked up a pen and signed her name. Months later, Emma walked through the streets of New York, a bouquet of roses in her hands. She stopped at a familiar corner. A young girl stood there, shivering, holding a bundle of flowers. Emma stepped forward and bought every single one. The cycle had come full circle. But this time, Emma stood in the heart of New York City, staring up at the massive skyscrapers that loomed above. For years, this city had been a battleground for her survival, a place where she fought for every dollar selling flowers on the streets. But now she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting to change everything. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind. Kane's empire collapsed under the weight of his corruption, and Alexander had given her a path to something she never thought possible, a future. But change came at a price, and Emma was about to learn just how high that price could be. With Kane gone, his empire didn't just disappear, it fractured. His former business partners scrambled to cover their tracks. Rival corporations moved in like vultures, trying to seize his assets. And the city's underground figures, the ones who had thrived under Kane's rule, wanted revenge. That's where the real danger began. Emma sat in Alexander's office, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. Across from her, Rachel and David scanned a list of financial records. Rachel sighed. "It's worse than we thought." Alexander leaned forward. "How bad?" David swiped through the files on his tablet. Kane's network wasn't just about money. It was about control. Even with him gone, the people he empowered are still out there. Emma's grip tightened around the cup. "Then we have to finish what we started." Alexander nodded, but his expression was grim. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of." Just because Kane was in prison didn't mean the war was over. There was someone else, someone who had worked in the shadows, just beneath Kane. Victor Monroe, a silent investor, a strategist, a man who never showed his face, but controlled everything. And now he was cleaning up Kane's mess his way. Emma had always been careful. She had spent years learning how to move through the city without being seen. But she wasn't invisible anymore. She was a problem. And Victor Monroe wanted problems to disappear. One evening, as Emma walked home, she felt it, that prickling sensation at the back of her neck, the kind that told her she was being watched. She turned a corner, and a black SUV was parked across the street. The windows were tinted, no plates. Emma's heart pounded. She wasn't the same scared little girl she had been months ago. But she also wasn't foolish enough to think this was a coincidence. She quickened her pace, darting into a side alley, twisting through the maze of buildings like she had done 100 times before. But this time, she wasn't fast enough. A figure stepped out from the shadows, tall, broad, a scar running across his jaw. He blocked her path. "Miss Carter." His voice was smooth, too smooth. Emma's breath hitched. She knew that name. Victor Monroe's enforcer, Liam Price. Price didn't attack. He simply smiled. And that was worse. "You and Mr. Reed have made quite the mess." He adjusted the cuff of his expensive coat. "My employer believes you should reconsider your involvement." Emma's jaw clenched. "Your employer?" Price chuckled. "Let's not play games. You know exactly who I'm talking about. Victor Monroe. The man who had been controlling Kane's finances. The man who stood to lose the most, now that Kane was gone." Emma folded her arms. "And if I say no?" Price's smile didn't waver, but his eyes darkened. "Then we stop asking nicely." Emma wasn't afraid of threats, but she knew better than to ignore them. The moment she got back to Alexander's penthouse, she told him everything. He listened without a word, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he stood. "It's time to end this." Rachel looked up sharply. "You're not suggesting we go after Monroe?" Alexander's voice was cold, final. Emma's stomach tightened. This was bigger than Kane, bigger than anything they had done before. But if they didn't finish this, Monroe would destroy everything. They had one shot. Monroe's empire was built on secrecy. They had to expose him. His network ran on fear. They had to break it, and most importantly, they had to hit him where it hurt. His money, his power, his reputation. Rachel set up the bait, a false business deal. One that Monroe couldn't resist. David hacked into his offshore accounts, pulling just enough data to make Monroe paranoid. And Emma? She played the wild card. She let Monroe's people find her. She made them believe she was scared, weak. That was Monroe's mistake. Because when the time came, she was ready. Monroe didn't come himself. He sent Price. And this time, Emma didn't run. She stood her ground. "You think you can scare me?" She met his gaze, steady, unwavering. "You think I don't know how people like you work?" Price smirked. "I think you're out of your depth, little girl." Emma stepped forward. "Then prove it." And that was the moment. The moment when the trap snapped shut. Rachel leaked the financial records. David exposed Monroe's dealings with dirty politicians. The FBI raided his headquarters that very night. Within 24 hours, Monroe was finished. The last time Emma saw Price, he was in handcuffs, and Monroe, he disappeared. But the world knew who he was, and there was nowhere left for him to hide. It was over. But not without scars. Alexander had been right. Winning came at a price, and Emma had paid it. But she had no regrets, because for the first time, she wasn't just fighting to survive. She was fighting for something bigger, and she wasn't done yet. The city never truly slept. Even in the quietest hours, New York hummed with life, its streets filled with people chasing dreams or running from them. For Emma Carter, this city had been both a prison and a battlefield. But now it was a proving ground. Everything she had fought for, the sacrifices, the risks, the battles, had led to this moment. She had helped tear down an empire of corruption. But what came next? Building something better. Emma stood at the top floor of REIT Enterprises, staring out over the city. For years, she had looked up at these towers, wondering what kind of lives people lived inside them. Now she was part of it. It's yours if you want it. She turned. Alexander stood behind her, hands in his pockets, calm, calculated, but waiting. Emma raised an eyebrow. What exactly is it? Alexander gestured toward the city below. A seat at the table. Emma's chest tightened. This wasn't just a job offer. This was an opportunity to change everything. Alexander didn't just hand out favors. If Emma was going to take a role in his world, she had to earn it. That meant learning the rules and how to break them. Rachel and David helped her navigate the corporate battlefield. Rachel taught her the politics, the deals, the negotiations, the strategies people use to stay on top. David taught her the numbers, how money moved, how empires were built, and how they collapsed. Alexander taught her something else entirely, how to see through the lies, and most importantly, how to make sure no one ever controlled her again. Just because Monroe was gone didn't mean the world stopped spinning. His absence created a power vacuum, and people rushed to fill it. Emma soon realized power was never truly destroyed. It just changed hands. And if she wanted to build something real, she had to fight for it. Emma's first real challenge came sooner than expected. The city's biggest real estate moguls had their eyes on Monroe's abandoned properties, and they weren't playing fair. Rachel dropped a thick folder onto the table in front of Emma. "They want to buy up the blocks we saved," Rachel said. "Turn them into luxury condos." Emma's jaw tightened. These were the neighborhoods where she had once sold flowers, where families barely got by. If these developers won, those people would be forced out. "No," Emma said firmly. "We're not letting that happen." Alexander studied her. "Then, what's your move?" Emma took a breath and laid out her plan. Emma wasn't just going to block the deals, she was going to flip the entire game. Instead of letting the developers take control, she and Alexander bought up the properties first. They didn't just outbid the competition. They exposed their corruption. Rachel leaked documents showing their illegal evictions. David found hidden tax fraud buried in their books. And Emma? She took it straight to the press. Within days, the developers were under investigation. Within weeks, their projects collapsed. And the best part, the city handed the properties to them instead. Emma didn't just protect those neighborhoods, she owned them now. But victory came with a cost. Powerful people didn't like losing. The real estate developers weren't just going to walk away. Soon, the threats started. Anonymous calls in the middle of the night. A brick through Alexander's office window. Even Rachel's apartment was broken into. And then, someone went after Emma directly. It happened fast. One evening, Emma stepped out of a coffee shop near her old neighborhood. She barely noticed the black sedan parked nearby, until it started moving, fast, straight toward her. Emma's breath caught. She had 1 second to react, and she jumped. The car screeched past, missing her by inches. People screamed. The sedan sped off, disappearing into the night. Emma scrambled to her feet, heart pounding. This wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration of war. Alexander was furious. Rachel wanted to pull back, lay low, until they figured out who was responsible. But Emma was done playing defense. She stood in Alexander's office, bruises still fresh, eyes burning with determination. "We don't hide." Alexander watched her for a long moment. Then, he smiled. Not the cold, calculated smirks of a CEO, but something different, something proud. "Then, let's finish this." They didn't just fight back. They destroyed the enemy. Rachel found proof of illegal funding for their projects. David traced their offshore accounts and froze their assets. Alexander used his connections to ensure they were blacklisted from the industry. And Emma? She did something none of them expected. She took the fight public. Emma stood in front of a packed room, cameras rolling. She didn't just expose corruption. She told her own story. She spoke about the streets she grew up on, the nights she sold flowers to survive, the system that had tried to break her, and the fact that she refused to let it win. Her words spread like wildfire. People listened, people cared. And suddenly, Emma wasn't just some girl from the streets. She was a voice, a force. And for the first time, she realized she had power too, real power, the kind that no one could take away. That night, Emma stood beside Alexander on the balcony of his penthouse. The city stretched before them, lit up, alive, and for the first time it belonged to her. "You did it," Alexander said. Emma turned to him and smiled. "We're just getting started." New York had a way of remembering people. Some were etched into history books, some were whispered about in backroom deals, and some names rose from nothing, only to become something unshakable. Emma Carter was becoming one of those names, but with that name came a responsibility and a target on her back. Emma had fought hard for this moment. For the first time in her life, she was in control. She had saved the neighborhoods where she once sold flowers. She had exposed corruption at the highest levels. She had earned the trust of the most powerful man in the city. But power didn't come without consequences, and soon she would learn. Not everyone wanted to see her succeed. It started with a phone call. Late at night, Emma was in her office, going over plans for a new community project, when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She hesitated. Then she picked up. "You should walk away." A man's voice. Cold, flat. Emma's pulse spiked. "Excuse me? You don't belong here." Her grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" Silence. Then a low chuckle. "Oh, clicky." The line went dead. Emma knew this wasn't random. She had made powerful enemies, and now they were starting to push back. She rushed to Alexander's office, her mind racing. "Someone just threatened me." Alexander looked up from his desk, expression unreadable. "What did they say?" "That I don't belong here." Alexander leaned back, steepling his fingers. Then, after a long pause, "They're testing you." Alexander wasn't surprised. He had seen this before. "They want to see if you'll run." Emma crossed her arms. "And if I don't?" Alexander's lips curled into something almost like approval. "Then they'll come at you harder." Emma's stomach tightened. This wasn't a game. She was stepping into a world where people played dirty, where threats weren't just words, but she wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. If her enemies were watching, Emma was going to give them something to see. She doubled down on her work, launching a new project to build affordable housing in the city's poorest areas, partnering with community leaders to fight back against predatory landlords, using her growing influence to push for real change. And then, she took a step no one expected. She went public. Emma sat in front of a panel of journalists, cameras flashing. "People think I don't belong here." She let the words sink in. "They think because I grew up on the streets, I don't deserve a seat at the table." She looked straight into the cameras. "But here's the thing. They don't get to decide that. The people do." The response was instant. Social media exploded. Her words spread like wildfire. And suddenly, Emma Carter wasn't just a name. She was a movement. But with every rise, there was always a fall waiting to happen. The next morning, it hit. Newspapers ran a brutal headline. "Emma Carter, from street rat to corporate puppet." The article questioned everything. Was she really fighting for the people? Or was she just a pawn in Alexander Reed's empire? Had she sold out? Emma felt the sting. She had worked so hard to prove herself, and now People were doubting her. Alexander barely reacted. This is the cost of power. But for Emma, it was personal. That night, she got another call. But this time, the voice was familiar. Meet me. It was Michael Carter, her father. Emma hadn't seen her father in years. Now, he wanted to talk. She met him at a diner in Brooklyn, one of the places she used to walk past as a kid. Michael looked older, rougher, like a man who had been running from something for a long time. You've made a name for yourself, he said, stirring his coffee. Emma didn't waste time. What do you want? Michael leaned in. To help you. Emma laughed. You left. You don't get to walk back in now and act like you care. Michael didn't flinch. You don't understand. The people coming after you. I know them. Emma froze. What are you talking about? Michael exhaled slowly. Then, he dropped a name, and Emma's blood ran cold. The name Michael whispered was one Emma had heard before, but only in hushed conversations. A man who operated in the shadows, a man more dangerous than Monroe ever was. Vincent Graves, and according to Michael, he wanted Emma gone. Emma left the diner with her mind spinning. She had fought battles before, but this was different. Vincent Graves wasn't just a businessman. He was a kingmaker, the kind of man who didn't just destroy careers, he destroyed lives. Emma had a choice: walk away or face him head on. Her heart pounded. She already knew the answer. She wasn't running. Not now. Not ever. The city was holding its breath. The moment Emma Carter decided not to back down, she became more than just a rising star. She became a threat. And threats? They needed to be eliminated. It started small. A few anonymous emails, a fake scandal circulating online, rumors that Emma had been secretly working with corrupt officials, all designed to shake the public's trust in her. But then, it escalated. One morning, Emma walked into her office and froze. Her desk was wrecked, papers shredded, computer screen cracked, and sitting in the middle of the chaos, a single white rose. Her hands shook as she picked it up. On the petals, scrawled in red ink, "Time's running out." Emma locked the doors, breathing hard. Then she called Alexander. "It's happening." Silence. Then, "Come to my office. Now." Emma arrived at Reed Enterprises within minutes. Alexander was already waiting, arms crossed, expression cold. She threw the rose onto his desk. "Vincent Graves sent this, didn't he?" Alexander studied the flower, his jaw tightening. "Yes." Emma's breath hitched. "Then we need to act before he does." But Alexander shook his head. You need to step back." Emma stared at him. "Excuse me?" Alexander exhaled, his voice lower. "You don't understand what he's capable of." "I don't care." He slammed his hand against the desk. "You should." His voice was sharper than she had ever heard it. And for the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. But stepping back wasn't an option anymore. That night, as Emma left the office, she noticed a black SUV idling near the curb. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't paranoid. She was being watched. She quickened her pace. But before she could reach her car, the SUV doors burst open. Two men in dark suits grabbed her. She struggled, kicked, but they were stronger. A cloth covered her mouth, and then darkness. Emma woke up in a dimly lit warehouse. Her wrists were tied to a chair, and across from her, Vincent Graves, a man nobody ever saw, until it was too late. He smiled. "Miss Carter, we finally meet." Emma swallowed hard, keeping her voice steady. "Cut the theatrics. What do you want?" Vincent chuckled, shaking his head. "I like you. You remind me of myself, before I learned how the real world works." He leaned forward. "So, I'll make you a deal. Emma's jaw clenched. I'm not interested. Vincent smirked. You should be, because if you don't take it, he gestured to the shadows. And Emma's blood ran cold, because stepping out of the darkness was Michael Carter, her father, and he looked terrified. Michael's voice was hoarse. Emma, please, listen to him. Emma's stomach twisted. You're working for him? Michael flinched. Vincent laughed. Working for me? No. He owes me. Emma's mind raced. Her father had been missing for years, and now he was standing beside her worst enemy. Michael clenched his fists. Emma, I had no choice. Vincent smirked. But you do. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a contract. Sign this, and I let him go. Emma's heart pounded. What is it? Vincent leaned in. You walk away. You stop meddling in things that aren't your business. And in return, he glanced at Michael. I don't bury him. Emma's mind was spinning. This was bigger than her, bigger than just a fight for justice. This was about survival, her father's survival. She looked at Michael. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Then she looked at Vincent, and she knew. If she signed this, she would never be free. She took a deep breath, and then she made her choice. Slowly, Emma reached for the pen. Vincent smiled. Michael looked relieved. But then, Emma did something no one expected. She snapped the pen in half. Go to hell! Everything exploded. Vincent's smile vanished. Michael gasped. And then, the doors burst open, gunshots, voices shouting, and suddenly Emma was free. Someone cut her ropes. And when she turned, it was Alexander. And he was furious. I told you to step back. Emma wiped blood from her lip. And I told you I don't quit. Vincent was dragged away by Alexander's men. Michael? He stood there trembling. And Emma? She didn't look back. Not this time. The war had been won. But victory always came with a cost. Emma sat in Alexander's office, staring out at the city skyline. The glow of the streetlights flickered against the glass, but all she could feel was emptiness. Michael Carter, her father, was gone again. This time, not by choice. He was in federal custody. And despite everything, she still wasn't sure if she had saved him or destroyed him. The takedown of Vincent Graves sent shockwaves through the city. News outlets ran headlines like, The Carter Girl Who Took Down a Crime Lord, David versus Goliath, How Emma Carter Changed the Game, Reed Enterprises CIO and his unlikely protege. The press hounded her. They wanted her story. They wanted her pain. But Emma, she just wanted silence. 2 weeks later, she sat across from Alexander at his penthouse office. He slid a thick envelope across the desk. What's this? She asked. Alexander leaned back. Your future. Emma hesitated. She opened it and froze. Inside was a full scholarship to one of the top business schools in the country, along with a personal letter of recommendation from Alexander Reed himself. Emma's hands shook. I can't accept this. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Why not? Emma exhaled. Because I haven't earned it. His expression softened. You've earned more than you realize. But the past? It had other plans. That night, Emma got a call from an unknown number. She almost ignored it, until a voice on the other end whispered, You think this is over? Her blood ran cold. Vincent Graves may be gone, but the people who worked for him, they're still out there, and they remember you. Click. The line went dead. And suddenly, Emma knew. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next morning, she walked into Alexander's office. He glanced up. Change of heart. Emma set the scholarship envelope on his desk. I appreciate this. I really do. He frowned. But? She met his gaze. But I'm not leaving? Silence. Then Alexander sighed, rubbing his temples. Emma, she cut him off. You trained me to be stronger, to fight back, to build something bigger than myself. She leaned forward. Now, let me do that. Alexander studied her for a long moment. Then, he smirked. You're as stubborn as I was at your age. Emma crossed her arms. Guess that means I'm learning from the best. He chuckled. Then, he picked up his phone. Rachel, bring her the files. She's in. And just like that, Emma Carter wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a force to be reckoned with. That night, Emma stood on her balcony, looking down at the streets below. The city never slept. Neither did its demons, and in the distance, a single black car idled at the curb, watching, waiting. A reminder that no matter how far she had come, Emma had changed. Gone was the timid girl who once stood in the cold selling flowers. Now, she stood at the heart of a battle that was bigger than just her past. It was about power, corruption, and the cost of doing the right thing. One evening, as Emma walked home, a voice called out, Emma Carter. She turned. A man stood in the alleyway, mid-40s, expensive suit, but with a scar down his cheek, a reminder of the world her father had once been a part of. You're making enemies in places you don't understand. Emma clenched her fists. Who are you? The man smirked. A messenger, and my message is simple. Walk away. Her heart pounded. And if I don't? His smile faded. Then I suggest you say goodbye to your loved ones. Then he was gone, like a shadow slipping back into the night. But Emma, she wasn't afraid. She was ready. Back at Alexander's penthouse, Emma paced. Rachel, Alexander's assistant, handed her a file. You were right. Graves wasn't working alone. There's still one name missing. Emma opened the file and froze. Robert Kane, Alexander's oldest rival. Emma's hands shook. I knew it. He's still pulling the strings. Alexander leaned against his desk. I never thought Kane would go this far. He's not just after me anymore. He's after you. Emma met his gaze. Then let's end this. They planned everything. Emma would go undercover at Kane's charity gala, a grand event filled with New York's elite, a perfect cover and a perfect place for Kane to make his next move. But there was one problem. Kane knew Emma was a threat, so she wouldn't go as herself. Instead, Rachel worked her magic. Emma Carter became Emily Daniels, a young entrepreneur, a rising star and bait. The night of the event, Emma walked into the ballroom. Dressed in an elegant black gown, hair swept back, she looked nothing like the girl who once sold flowers. Kane noticed her immediately. And who might you be? He asked, offering his hand. Emma smiled. Someone you should get to know. The game had begun. As the night went on, Kane let his guard down. He talked, bragged. He had no idea Emma was recording everything. Then, the moment she waited for, Kane leaned in, smirking. You remind me of someone, huh? That Carter girl. Poor thing. Doesn't know she's in over her head. Emma's heart pounded. This was it. She met his gaze. Funny. I was just thinking the same thing about you. Kane's expression darkened. But before he could react, the FBI stormed in. Lights flashed. Cameras snapped. And in the chaos, Emma whispered, checkmate. Kane was arrested. His empire crumbled. But Emma, she knew this wasn't just a win. It was a warning. Because as Kane was dragged away, he didn't look afraid. He smirked. And as their eyes met one last time, he mouthed, it's not over. A chill ran down Emma's spine, because she knew the world had changed for Emma Carter. But more importantly, Emma had changed. She was no longer the little girl selling flowers in the cold. She was something more, something stronger. And tonight, she would prove it. New York City was buzzing. Kane's arrest had made headlines. Billionaire Robert Kane, exposed in corporate corruption scandal. Whistleblower Emma Carter brings down one of New York's most powerful CEOs. But Emma, she wasn't celebrating, because the battle wasn't over. Not yet. Alexander sat in his office, staring at the city skyline. He had spent years building his empire, but now, for the first time, he wondered if it had been worth it. Then a knock. Emma. She stepped inside, looking different, more mature, more determined. She placed a single rose on his desk. Alexander raised an eyebrow. A flower? Emma smiled. A reminder. He looked at her, questioning. Emma sat down. You once told me power is about control. But I've learned something different. She leaned forward. Real power is about impact. Alexander watched her carefully. He had underestimated her, and now she was about to change the world. Emma stood on stage, in front of thousands, reporters, activists, business leaders, and behind her, a new foundation. The Million Roses Initiative, a program designed to help kids like her, to give them opportunities, to change their futures. She took a deep breath, then spoke. I used to sell flowers. I thought that was the only way I could survive. But then I met someone who saw potential in me. She turned to Alexander in the audience, and for the first time, he smiled. Emma continued. So, today, I want to be that person for someone else. The crowd erupted in applause. That night, Emma walked down the same street where she had once sold flowers, and there, a little girl stood in the cold, holding a single rose. Emma stopped. The girl looked up. $1 for a flower, miss. Emma smiled and bought the whole bouquet because she knew. As Emma walked away, the little girl stared at the money in her hand, eyes wide with disbelief. She turned to Emma, her voice small but filled with hope. Why did you buy them all? Emma knelt down, meeting the girl's gaze. Because someone once did the same for me. The girl clutched the flowers to her chest, and for the first time that night, she smiled. And that's how change begins, one act of kindness at a time. But now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done if you were in Alexander's shoes? Would you have stopped for Emma that night, or would you have walked away? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this again. Because trust me, the next one, you won't want to miss it. See you soon. Love.